town of the good, the bad, and the weird. You either live by the gun, or you die by the sword.
Welcome to The Good, the Bad, and the Weird. I'm Nicho.
And I'm Chris.
And today, they're coming to get you, Chris.
Oh no, the slowest bad guys ever.
Yes.
Yes. Today we're going to talk about Night of the Living Dead.
The original 1968 one.
Specifically the original one. And to celebrate. So, as you guys all know, we love how movies are made. And when I discovered that, once again, my favorite blood condiment was used in this movie as well, Bosco's chocolate sauce, I got chocolate milk for us. But I know you don't like chocolate, so Good. I got you strawberry milk instead.
Thank you. I don't really like milk, but strawberry milk's fine.
I was going to try and get almond milk because I shouldn't drink milk. But you know what? I'm only going to drink half of this and give the other half to my husband, who should also not drink milk.
Oh, your bed shall be gassy tonight.
It'll be fine. It's fine. Worth it. Yeah, I got me a real quiet one, and I got you the loudest container I could find for our podcast.
Good. I mean, I did it. Karma comes around. I got my brother and I had to go out and find the bag of chips for my brother once. We found the loudest bag we could get.
Yes.
Sun chips.
Ah, yeah. Especially the old one.
Yes. So, anywho, back on track.
So to start off spooky season, let's get right down to the original zombie movie.
Yes and no. The original modern zombie film.
Agree.
Because zombie film started way back in the day and with White Zombie.
Yes. And White Zombie, I hadn't actually seen White Zombie, but I had seen lots of clips and like photos from White Zombie. So White Zombie is a good depiction, I think, of what zombies used to be. Well,
it is the first feature zombie film. It was made in 1932. And it was made, and this has been kind of a trend up until recently, it was made on a shoestring budget. Yes. It used the remnants of Dracula's set, Frankenstein, and one other classic movie, and just repurposed them. Even Bela Lugosi came back.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have seen White Zombie, and it's
a fun movie. I got through about half of it before I had to switch over and start researching other stuff. And I enjoyed it, but it's not my type of zombie.
No,
this is the old school zombie. This is what everyone used to think of when zombies came to mind. It was the old
Haitian,
people under a spell. Not always a dead body, but most of the time a dead body. Slaves doing a master's bidding, sort of thing.
And that can actually come off of there was a book written. Where is it in my notes? So there was a book written in 1929 called The Magic Island, and it was written by Williams Seabrook.
Yes.
And
his name came up a lot in my research.
And he's kind of the start of the voodoo zombie craze.
Yes, and specifically the term zombie. Because when I was doing my research, I ran into a lovely video by one of my favorite YouTubers, Ask a Mortician, going into how the concept of a zombie isn't necessarily as young as a lot of us like to think it is. No. It's just the term. So, like, she was talking about medieval zombies and how back then it was more of a religious thing where a demon or a spirit was possessing a dead body. But you can still see traces of that because from all of the research I did, thanks to her, after my Google deep dive, the idea of, like, things like you have to cremate the body, you gotta take off the head, or back then, I guess brain wasn't really, like, the thing, but taking off the head, which back then was a huge deal because you wanted your body intact for the second coming and Jesus purposes.
I mean, look at nearly headless Nick.
Poor guy. He just wanted to participate. But you can see those trends that then kind of worked their way through.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, it's not just European horror of undead coming back to life. You can see it in a lot of different religions and cultures throughout the world.
And it's important before we really get into Night of the Living Dead to kind of talk about the history. I'd actually like to bring up my main source for this episode. I read a book called Zombies on Film, The Definitive History of Undead Cinema by Ozzy Ignazio.
Good luck. Yeah, I have no idea how to pronounce that.
Again, I suck with saying names. Every name is different.
Yep.
But this book is actually a good source for like just an intro. It doesn't go super in depth, but it gives you enough information and gives you a bunch of titles to go and explore.
Yes.
Post reading or ones that you can connect back into each other.
Yeah, especially because the zombie like franchise, I guess you could call it, it hasn't always been a very nice, neat, linear package like it is nowadays. Originally, things like I Am Legend, the book, not the new movie, which is good, but
yes, arguably
arguably less zombie based than the original book. That book inspired a bunch of different interpretations of zombies.
Specifically, Night of the Living Dead, it was an inspiration for.
Exactly.
But even then, they weren't zombies. They were, vampires or something?
So in I Am Legend, they're closer to vampires than they are zombies, but they're also, I guess, as vampire purists, especially nowadays, could argue that they're not really vampires either. We have nice, neat categories now, and that's kind of been a fun thing watching people try and break with the newer horror movies, as far as breaking out of, like, is this a werewolf movie? Is this a monster? Like, especially for monster movies. But back then, it seems like that line was kind of wiggled all over the sand, and you kind of jumped around it as much as you wanted.
And one movie that was inspired by I Am Legend was The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price.
Yes. And I kind of think it's interesting because this movie did something that was kind of a fun take. When they were writing it, they specifically looked at all of these other examples and thought about where in the outbreak sort of scenario these things were happening. And I think it was the director in the 40th anniversary documentary that I was watching. He was talking about how he really appreciated that a lot of these took place halfway through or at the end of the big outbreak, and he wanted to talk about the story at the beginning of the outbreak. Yes,
and that's how Romero got the start of Night of the Living Dead. Well, and even before Romero put his twist on it, even because he didn't even call them zombies to begin with.
No. I think he only calls them ghouls throughout both the script and the movie.
Well, so there's a little bit to that. In the beginning of the movie, well, at the start of the movie, it was originally, the original title for the movie was called Night of the Flesh Eaters, not Night of the Zombies. He thought he was creating an original creature.
Yes. And even before that, he wanted to call it Night of Anubis, but nobody got his joke.
No. And so even before Romero completely revolutionized this genre, there was a shift in the 50s that was more towards a sci-fi, aliens coming, taking over.
Yes.
Plan B from outer space or whatever.
Yeah. And just an emphasis in space in general. You could see it in just about every facet of culture back then, which was, I think, really fun because the idea was future and what is out there, but also play off the fear of that unknown. I will say, I am impressed you managed to get aliens into our zombie flick.
Well, it's a huge shift in it, though.
It is. And I also, we were watching it, and my husband had already seen it in its entirety rather recently. So he was rewatching it recently, and he goes, wait a minute, is this just an alien movie? Did Nico trick you into watching an alien movie? Because part of the way through, during the radio announcement, they talk about how this is linked to a satellite that had come back from Saturn. And then also the director talked about how the first two adaptations of his script, this was supposed to have been aliens coming to Earth and taking over bodies and looking for human flesh.
Yeah.
And then it morphed into zombies. So, kind of alien zombies?
Yeah, well, I mean, even then you can still think of it. It's not, you see it in other films like Who Could Kill a Child, where this powder rain, you don't ever see it in the movie, but they talk about how powder rained down from the sky and turned the children into not cannibals, just killers.
Yeah.
And same with like Night of the Comet. I mean, there's a lot of movies with this kind of motif of something outside of us. And that could even be started back in, I know H.P. Lovecraft's writings, the early 20s. Sure.
Yeah.
And I know there was stuff before him that was talking about it. I don't think Edgar Allan Poe has a specific one on it, but his toes the line of the unseen, the unknown.
Definitely. And I kind of liked that the writers took this approach and left it. They gave an answer to it, but they didn't explore it very far, because this is something that a lot of modern zombie movies and franchises, I get bored with real quick, because they spend a lot of time explaining how the zombies came about and why it is, and then you get lost in all the plot holes with it. Whereas this one was just like, we don't know, it's just here, deal with it.
Yeah, and I think some of them do it successfully, where we have an intro like 28 Days Later, where it gives you what happened at the beginning or what was the cause of it.
Sure.
And they do it in the first 5 minutes, and then there's a big skip of time where everything's gone to shit.
Yes. I did like this one too, from, I guess, a interesting look on the different ways people react to this. So this movie was important because zombies up until this point were not the flesh-eating, mindless cannibals and slow-walking cannibals. They were people doing the bidding of other people. So this one, it was interesting to see how this sort of horror, we weren't watching tropes of people. This was the first time we'd had a dumb, almost useless main character, usually a female. We'd had the strong, independent punch asks questions later. We had the paranoid stereotype. We had the injured, who's definitely going to be a zombie later on down the flick and cause issues for everyone. We had the worried parent.
The young couple.
The young couple. We had all of them start from this movie.
Yeah. Well, so this movie, to put it into perspective, it was just 10 friends who had created a new movie pictures production company, decided to go and make a low-budget horror film after doing successful commercials in the Pittsburgh area.
Yes. And none of them really knew how to make a movie. They all had kind of bits and pieces here and there from the interviews that I watched, and they had a general idea of what they were doing, but none of them had done this in practice before.
Well, and that's kind of the spirit that they embodied, is
definitely. This
group of young, energetic filmmakers wanted to tell a story, and they just went and did it.
Yes, they did.
And we see that a lot nowadays with the DIY movement and all that stuff going on.
Oh, sure. I think, though, that this one stands apart because they weren't... And even the actors who played in it, you can see this really well in that the 40 Years Later documentary. Everyone who's on it is absolutely amazed that anyone has seen this movie at all. They were just having fun with it. They were really excited to even be part of a movie. A lot of them didn't think this was going to take them anywhere, and were happy that it didn't really kick off anyone's career in a major way. They just had a blast making the movie. And
one of the things, though, too, is that a lot of stuff kind of happened by chance.
It did.
In the opening scene, the car crashing. The car was fine in the scene before. Well, the day after they used it for that scene, I think it was the producer's mom's car. She got in an accident.
Whoops.
And so, perfect. The car crashes. We don't have to damage this car. It's already damaged.
Yes.
I think they mentioned they did end up breaking a window on it by accident, but they put it in the insurance claim.
Yes. And Or like the iconic scene where the first zombie is breaking the car window with the rock. The guy,
yes, that's the scene.
Yeah, the actor was told, "Hey, we want you to pick up this rock over here and bash in the window." And he picks up this big rock and he hits the window and it just bounces off. And in the interview, he's talking about how he was like, "I kind of thought the rock would just go through." So he hits it. He had to hit it, I think, 3 times. And then when the third time the rock goes through, he says, "I accidentally let go. Luckily, the camera was fine."
Which, by the way, speaking of potential accidents, I learned from someone today that one of the stunt doubles in the Resident Evil movie, or one of the Resident Evil movies, lost her arm.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Well, but now can they be like one-armed stunt person? Surely there's a market for that.
She has a tattoo that has a scissors.
Aww.
Where it was cut off. But that's a different story for a different time.
Stunt people. You're amazing.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I learned Uma Thurman's stunt double has become more of a mainstream actress now or more bit parts here and there. But she's a good actress too. Like, I was watching Death Proof, which kind of relates to this because the double feature Planet Terror that came before it is an homage to all the zombie movies that came before.
Yeah. With
bringing it into modern times with a chemical that came from the Iraq War.
Oh.
But she did all her stunts in Death Proof, and
cool.
It's fantastic to watch her do that.
Well, needless to say, there was no stunt doubles hired for this movie.
No.
There was barely actors hired for this movie.
Well,
but that was kind of the fun.
And that's the thing, it was all local people. They just pulled from where they were at in Pittsburgh. They shot it. They're like, okay, this looks good. Send it off to New York and see if someone bites.
Yeah, and one of my favorite interviews was of the gal who I think she was one of the actresses in the movie, on top of also being the makeup person. She was talking about how she had done some like local theater makeup before, but she'd never done zombie makeup before. And she was explaining that's why you see a difference between the zombies from the earlier shots to the later shots, because she just got better.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, it was a short shooting time frame. I mean, they really had to improvise. I mean, they were living in that house too, which that's another cool like little thing that happened is they just happened to hear that this house was being scheduled for demolition, and they're like, "Hey, can we use this?" And they're like, "Sure, we don't care what you do with it. It's going to be destroyed anyways." Yeah. So they furnished it. They lived in it. They had no running water. Like,
they were talking about how all of them had to take turns going and getting water in buckets so that they could flush the toilet.
Mm-hmm. And like the kitchen, they had to clean it to make it feel like it was lived in, but not like an entire cast and crew was living there.
Yes.
And it was fun listening to them, especially in the Criterion collection, the interviews of them just like, because I watched the movie first, because I've seen this movie so many times. I watched it with commentary.
Nice.
For the first time. And they're just talking about like, oh, here's this little mistake here. Here's this little mistake here. Like, oh, where we removed this plank. Here's our notes on the back of the plank for where this is supposed to be.
Yes. But honestly, like, even if you're an eagle-eyed watcher, it's not super noticeable, especially since it was filmed black and white. And it's filmed a little bit more on the grainy side. Mm-hmm. Which I think adds a lot to this movie, honestly. When you're watching it, having that sort of, I guess, not really shaky camera work, but it's not a hard set camera work that I'm used to for more modern zombie films. And so because of that, there's a lot of little things that normally I'd get hung up on that I completely swept under the rug for this one. Mm-hmm. One of which would have been, like, example, the makeup. Normally I would have found the difference in the zombies a little bit awkward, but because this one was in black and white, it wasn't exactly the lighting wasn't exactly top notch. There's a lot of odd shadows here and there, not necessarily on their part, just because they're filming in an old house, and that's how it is.
Well, some of the shadows were intentional.
Yes. And then example being the difference between zombies in the house versus out of the house, and just time frame shots. Normally, I would find that really odd that the zombies have completely different appearances here and there, but because it's grainy, because it's black and white, and because the entire film kind of feels like just a for fun horror the entire time, even though it takes itself very, very seriously. There's a lot of stuff you just kind of gloss over.
Yeah, and at the same time, this is setting the standard for what a zombie movie was.
Yes.
Like, they talk about, like, they always had this idea of it being somewhat social, political, and having some bigger meaning to it, rather than just, these people went into this building, they fought zombies, they died.
Yes.
They unintentionally made it even more so political by casting an African American man,
yes,
as the lead role for the movie. And this movie, to give some perspective of how recent this development in zombie movies really is it was released 6 months after Martin Luther King was shot.
Yes, and the directors had a really good bit about that. They explained that the reason, I believe the actor's name was Dwayne Jones, got the part was someone else originally was scheduled for it, and a friend came and said, you really should check out this guy. He's a really great actor, and they absolutely loved his performance. And so, despite not changing anything with the script-wise, at least not at first,
yes,
for his role, they went through the whole movie, and then at the end, on their way to New York to drop off the film, they heard about Martin Luther King's death, and all of them, I guess, were like, well, it's too late now. This is how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. And, well, Dwayne's character originally was supposed to be this gung-ho trucker, punch first, ask questions later kind of guy.
Yeah.
But Dwayne changed his character script to fit him better as a person and as an actor.
Yes.
And honestly, if he hadn't been cast, this movie could have easily been forgotten. Not just because it carries such political weight to it, especially for the time, but because he is a much more relatable, personable character.
His acting for this movie is really what made you sit through the whole movie.
Mm-hmm.
The other main character, Barbara, she grates on me real quick, not gonna lie. Even though for the time I understand why her character is written and performed the way it is, I've just never been a big fan, which is part of the reason why in the remake her character is completely different. Yes,
which I haven't got around to the remake, but I plan to at some point.
Definitely.
I've heard it's not as great as the original, but...
No, it's not, but it is fun to see, because I think the remake was done with kind of the same spirit as the first one. People who loved the first one and just kind of want to improve on it and have fun with it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take it with that sort of grain of salt, it is a good movie to watch. I do recommend it. Barbara goes from being... she's very similar at the beginning of the movie, I think. She goes from being, in the first movie, this kind of in her own mind... traumatized, incapable of doing anything sort of person, and in the sequel she moves on to a much more powerful female role. But that's kind of just a narrative on the shift of the times. The original movie, that shift was given to Ben. Mm-hmm. That's what his character was for, and he did it very, very successfully. In the remake, while the character of Ben is still there, the attention is more on Barbara, because that's where, as a society and where we are right now in history, that's where our attention is.
Yeah, and that was in 1990, I think, when that was released.
Yeah.
Which, even more so, that's changed. And it's interesting seeing how movies have changed, because right now, on top of what we're watching, I've been going through a collection of films directed by Kenji Mizoguchi. And I was watching the first one, and it's called... the film I was watching, it was called Osaka Elegy. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, this feels very contemporary. This is modern. He deals with a lot of suffrage of women throughout society.
Okay.
And I kind of forgot for a minute that this collection, the first two movies, are pre-World War II. And the next two are post-World War II.
Ah,
and so
interesting.
But it's weird seeing these movies that we're still having similar plots. We're still having similar themes. And people are just building upon it.
Yeah. And even with the political mindset put aside, Dwayne Jones's performance was phenomenal. Mm-hmm. Hands down, probably the best acting out of the group, which is saying something, because at no point did I think anyone's acting was bad. Yeah. Everyone put on a great performance, especially for a bunch of people who are not necessarily actors.
They're theater actors, which is different than acting for a movie.
Exactly. Example being, I think the character's name is Carter, the annoying husband dad.
I can't remember his name.
Him. If a character in a movie can, within the first 5 words coming out of their mouth, immediately annoy me, mm-hmm. you know you've done a good acting job.
And he feels very reminiscent of the whole Red Scare.
Yes.
Like, that whole, the basement's the best place to be. They're not going to get to us there.
Well, and on top of that, his character is designed to be an offensive mm-hmm. Against Ben, and how Ben is trying to combat this. And so it is an interesting tactic, because we do see a bunch of different approaches to how to handle an unknown zombie invasion. Mm-hmm. We see the board up the house, arm yourself, be prepared to put up a fight. We see the complete shutdown. We see, I think his name's Carter. I'm gonna kick myself for not remembering yet another character's name. But we see the idea of get what you love dearest close to you and go hide. Mm-hmm. We see the disgruntled wife who doesn't necessarily agree with that decision, but she's not putting up that much of a fight.
No.
Because as I think she drops one line about how they don't like living together, yet it's still her husband, it's still her daughter, so she's gonna try and do what she can.
Stay together for the child.
Yes. And then we see the young couple who, they don't really know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They're kind of following whoever at the moment is the more powerful leader. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very interesting concept, because we see it a lot now, but in a very different sort of mindset.
Well, and that's a weird thing too, because generally movies where characters don't have an actual character, I'll call it arc or progression, these characters are very much the same they are at the beginning. It's very much like Back to the Future, where sure. Marty McFly is the exact same person he was at the beginning of the movie.
The only thing he gained was the knowledge that he can time travel.
Yeah. And that's the thing with these characters too. It's how you imprint yourself on the specific character.
Definitely. I think the only character who you could make an argument has any development in this mm-hmm. movie is unfortunately Barbara, because it's subtle, but the actress herself, despite how much the character grates on me, and mm-hmm. I don't really enjoy listening to her interviews, as she strikes me very much as like just a normal person who happened to be an actress for this one movie. I don't know. She's just not one of my favorite interviewers to watch, which isn't a bad thing. It's just I'm not an interviewer person, I guess. But she does talk about how Barbara starts off as kind of a carefree child, moves over to having to deal with everything in her head and shutting down and having to process all that, mm-hmm. to at the final end getting her courage back and trying to help despite not doing a very good job.
Yeah. And it's something interesting to look at too, because when we were talking about scary stories to tell in the dark, that was my biggest complaint, is that the characters were so bland and uninteresting.
Yes.
And this movie, for some reason, I don't know if maybe it's just I'm much older now and this movie's beloved by me.
Yes.
But not only that, like I recognize that there's no character development. I think some of it has to do with the premise of everything too, and how it's weaved together, because these characters they all have their own individual identities.
Yes.
But there's no growth, there's no change. They're just in this situation that's unimaginable. And it toes that weird line between done right and done just kind of like I think I know what the issue is. In Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, they give a hint of a little bit more, whereas this one is just like these characters are what they are.
And I think another reason why these characters not having an arc doesn't bother me for this instance, as opposed to like Scary Stories, mm-hmm. Would be that these characters are not really meant to have an arc. I think the characters are meant to represent the different options that people have. Mm-hmm. So that way, every person who watches this movie, if, for example, if you are a basement hider, well, then you can make the argument and connect with that family and say, well, no, they're making the right decision. And it doesn't matter who you pick to have that connection with in this movie, because everybody dies.
In the end, we all meet the same fate.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why in this instance, having the relatively flat characters works, mm-hmm. is because they're not really supposed to be characters. They're supposed to be stand-ins for your ideas of how, if you were in that situation, you could approach it, kind of like having a choose-your-own storybook. Mm-hmm. But all of it's going at the same time, and you can change your mind whenever you want.
Yes. Well, some other little things about the movie that I found interesting. They just use generic library sci-fi music for this film.
Yes, which I liked a lot, especially since I live in a house full of musically inclined people. So it was a lot of fun to have the movie play and get to hear the, I think I know this tune, comments starting to happen. And it's because the tune and the music is in lots of movies. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's like in to modern times, I watch a YouTube video and I hear music that's played in our company bathroom.
Yeah, we need to talk to IT about that.
I'd be okay with it, because they used to do stuff every, like, Friday. They'd play a little bit of something, but now it's all the same.
They didn't just play a little bit of something. We had a whole Friday soundtrack, which was arguably part of the problem, but I do think maybe we need to at least get some more creative music from the free library. But the free library that this one has, the music, while you do recognize it from other locations, especially if you're into older films.
Old sci-fi films specifically, because that's where they pulled from.
Yes, and especially once, there's lots of lists of where all of this music has been played, and once you start down, you'll be instantly recognizing stuff. But I think they managed to pick, while it is recognizable, and it is that kind of that stereotype of general music for you to use for free, it's not so free sounding that even back then, because we've heard movies with the free soundtracks before and it's almost distracting. This one manages to blend it in with enough screams and dialogue and toning it down that it's not really...
And they only use snippets of it. They didn't use like a full 3-minute track.
No, which I think worked out probably best, because while I love a movie that has that memorable soundtrack to it, for this movie, I don't think a memorable soundtrack would have been a good thing.
And on the other side of that, I watched a zombie movie a while ago. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but the one thing I remember about it, it probably was a college project, but almost every song was old school Escape the Fate. But you only heard like the music and then like maybe one or two words, and then it was shut off by something or muted, and it's just like, you guys were towing the line there quite a bit.
Yeah, I think this movie does something kind of different than what I usually find and appreciate. Instead of having that iconic sound or song that goes with it, this one has iconic photographs.
Yes.
The photography that happened while this movie was being made, I think, even if you're not a zombie person, even if you're not a movie person, you have seen images from this movie.
Well, and that's partly because of the original title for the movie.
Yes.
So when this movie was first made, again, it was called Night of the Flesh Eaters.
Yes.
And they threw the copyright symbol on that.
Yes.
There was another company that found out, hey, they're making this movie and we already had that name beforehand. So they sent them a cease and desist letter. And so when they changed the name to Night of the Living Dead, that copyright was removed.
Yeah.
And so
the director talked about how, since none of them were really movie-making people. They didn't realize you were supposed to have put the copyright claim at the end of the movie after the credits. They only put it on the title.
Yep.
And I don't think they even were the ones who changed the title physically. I think the production company were the ones who snipped it out and then put the new one in.
Or the distribution company.
Yeah, that's who it was.
And fun fact about that company, I don't know their name off the top of my head, but they are also the ones who localized Godzilla.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, look at them.
Yeah, they're very good at bringing in independent movies.
Yeah. I know, I haven't checked up on it recently, because this is an older movie, but I know as of the 40th anniversary, there were still people who were part of this movie originally who are still fighting to get the copyright claim back.
Which, a couple years ago, they did.
Hooray!
And that's when it was added to the Criterion Collection.
Good for them.
But with that, the reason people have seen this movie so much is because if you've seen other horror films or you've seen other movies, this movie was so iconic that they just played it on everything they could.
Yeah. Well, and because it didn't have the copyright claim, it immediately got distributed to everybody physically possible.
And so you have varying degrees of quality, where you have the high, pristine, pulled right from the film, or this was ripped 20 times.
Yes. But, and I understand the frustration from the cast and crew on that copyright claim. But at the same time, because of that, this is arguably the most seen zombie movie ever. And
it really birthed a genre.
It really did.
Or a subgenre of horror.
Definitely.
And really, I mean, we're talking, this movie was in the late 60s, and we're still seeing the same type of zombie, albeit different. In fact, comes from different infections, with like the cordyceps in The Last of Us, or the girl with all the gifts.
Sure.
There was one where it was, I think it was just called Worms. It was about a suburb. I mean, the movie had an interesting idea. It took place in a suburb. They were all they were quarantined, but it was all through, like, you could tell the worms through the eyes.
Yeah.
I mean, we even have probably one of the most interesting zombie movies I've seen in a while is Contracted, where the zombie virus is an STD.
And you can even see a lot of the same overarching tropes in things like the Walking Dead TV show. The character types are still there. The zombie type is pretty similar to the ones from Night of the Living Dead. And you can even make the argument that even the small variations in zombies still can come back to this because of the two different colorations that were released. One of the colorations released the zombies having a green tint to them, and the other one had a gray tint. And because the makeup artist herself and the special effects artist were learning on the job, all of the different zombies are represented in this movie, one way or another. Yeah,
and, like, this is also the shift from... Now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever seen a zombie movie where they're specifically looking for brains. Like, this one, they're tearing guts out, they're using real guts. They're using real bones, which I learned if there's bone or if there's meat on the bone, that's silly putty.
And chocolate sauce.
Yes.
But do not worry, the ham was cooked. I did appreciate that the movie was low enough budget that one of the guys who was playing, I think he was playing a zombie, he also had a local butcher shop, and he donated all of the animal bits to the project.
The little bits that are unsavory for human consumption.
Yes. And I will say that I kind of agree with you on the brains thing. Now that I think back to it, all of the specifically brain-eating ones that I can think of that hit majorly, other than like the smaller movies, all of them I believe are some version of a parody of zombie movies.
Yeah.
I think iZombie, the TV show, is the one that pops into my head the most as most brain-centric. I believe she only ate brains, and she was pretending to be a mortician while being a zombie at the same time.
Yeah.
It was cute. I didn't watch very much of it, though.
I didn't either. As you know, I have a hard time keeping up with TV shows, and
fair.
As much as I love zombie films, this is probably one of my favorite subgenres of horror, regardless of how bad they are.
They are always bad. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite. I'm much more a werewolf person myself. But I will say, hands down, Night of the Living Dead is my favorite true zombie movie.
Yes. And I do like the original trilogy that Romero did. I feel with Land of the Dead, when he got when he got bigger and bigger budgets, just kind of...
Yeah.
It lost it for me when the zombies started getting smart.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of smart zombies. I like very specifically Night of the Living Dead zombies, only because I do very much enjoy the old school charm of being scared by something like this. I think, and we've talked about this before with our other horror movies that we've touched on, scary things have gotten to the point where we have to completely outdo ourselves to scare audiences now.
Yep. Where
this one, I think there was and I mean, it wasn't real, obviously. It was more of a publicity stunt. But there was a fake insurance policy for $50,000 for anyone who died of fright while watching this in theaters.
Oh, yeah. The whole, just keep telling yourself, it's only a movie.
Yes. But at the same time, there is something to be said about the more old school, quaint horror like this. This arguably is a very gory movie, but not by today's standards.
No.
But I like the old school standards. I like the one single pig gut on the grass and the chocolate sauce splattered on the walls, because to me, it's more of portraying the idea than actually having to see it. Which, I don't know. I think back then that was the fun, is what could you imagine is the worst thing? And this was it.
Well, to go against that, there's a Italian film called Zombie, Zombi. In Italy, it was released as Zombie 2. In the US, it was Zombie. And that upped the gore factor.
Yeah.
Like, we do keep seeing this progression. And that's one thing I will say that I really appreciated, because I started watching The Walking Dead. I didn't get past season 2.
Oh, same.
I was told it gets better, but I just stopped caring.
Same, but I saw bits of it thanks to people who I was friends with who watched literally all of it.
And I got to see the evolution of the zombies, because I'd stop by my parents' house and they'd be watching it, and it's like,
Same.
Okay. And that's the thing, is my family watches it, and my family's not really big horror films, besides my dad, who watches the cheesy garbage horror with me, and sometimes really good stuff too. Like, occasionally we'll stumble upon a movie we'll watch, and like, that actually wasn't bad. Like, we go into it and it's like, this is going to be total garbage. And then it's
not
pretty solid. Yeah.
My favorite.
But I will say, with zombies, especially with international media, they're the one that translates so well across every country. I mean, I've probably seen a zombie movie in 10 or so different languages.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason of that is where certain like monsters are you can very easily pinpoint on a map where that original idea came from. Like, Bigfoot is a very North American concept. Yeah, there's different versions of him, but what he is and does changes dramatically around those places.
Even vampires are very Eurocentric.
Especially our current idea of vampires. There's one of my favorite things is to investigate if you take off the word vampire and just take down to the concept. Bloodsucker, or the undead bloodsucker version.
A chupamafleble.
Yes. I mean, does that thing exist in all the countries and different cultures? Sure. There's a bunch of variations on it. I personally very much enjoy the hopping zombie vampires.
The Taoist.
Yes. Those are a lot of fun to me. But the idea very specifically of the undead zombie translates so nicely throughout all these cultures, and it does remain scary, unlike example being the hopping zombies vampires, which over here loses a bit of its spook and becomes just kind of a silly thing. Undead managed to be scary no matter where you are.
And there was kind of there was another fall of the zombie history. After Romero released his movie, there was a slew of zombie films all through the 70s and 80s that tried to copy that first big initial hit. And there have been some good movies in that time frame.
Oh, sure.
And there's been a lot of bad ones. Because, again, they're low budget. They can pump them out. And they're just like, here's a 20-pack of zombie films.
Yes.
But at the end of in the 80s, there was kind of a die down. Even Michael Jackson Thriller brought it back.
Yes, definitely.
But I will probably say video games have really brought zombies back into the forefront, specifically Resident Evil.
Oh, definitely. And Resident Evil does something kind of similar to how Night of the Living Dead originally did, with taking the overarching idea of zombie and playing with the physical, features of zombie.
Mm-hmm.
Playing with how they are portrayed. Where do zombies come from? What clothes do zombies wear? Is it none?
Big medicine.
Yeah.
Which, for me, Resident Evil was actually my first introduction to zombies, and not the movie. One of the times I was in Ohio, I was watching my cousin play through like the first 4 games, because you can clear these games in 4 hours.
Oh, yeah.
If you're really good at them.
Or like me, and not be able to finish any of them because I'm not good at them.
I've only beat the first 3. I haven't gone through the 4th one. It's just time consuming.
I love old video games, but I struggle so hard to play them.
Yeah. Well, one thing I learned from Zombies on Film, and this kind of pissed me off, and I already told you that it pissed me off earlier. So George Romero wrote the original script for Resident Evil. He liked it. He worked his ass off on it. Capcom liked it. It was going to be a true horror film. The company who owned the rights to the film is like, no, we want it to be an action movie.
Aww.
And that's why we have the slew of garbage that is the Resident Evil franchise. Arguably, the first movie's not bad.
I was gonna say, there's some people who really like that franchise out there, Nico. You starting wars.
I like the first movie. I really didn't like it from there. Like, okay, I understand you're trying to create this whole universe with original characters and whatnot.
Sure.
Second movie, let's just throw some fanfare in there.
Yeah.
Fan service, not fanfare, fan service.
There you go. That's the word. Yeah. I don't know. I like zombies and the idea of, like Resident Evil, that there's a lot of different avenues.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first zombie stuff that I ever came across was Rob Zombie's music videos. Which
his first band, White Zombie, is named after the first zombie movie.
Yes, and also just Rob Zombie in general seems to be quite the fan.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've seen a good chunk of his horror films, and he's
a talented guy.
Oh yeah.
At what he does.
I'm glad he's getting back into horror.
So much fun. But you can see how this movie influenced so much of the zombie franchise. And while I really like it, especially since this is my favorite version, I'm always here for new versions of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so Zombie is one of the ones where we're slowly starting to see the variations come through, which has been fun to watch.
I mean, with 28 Days Later and the remake of Dawn of the Dead, we see fast zombies now, which Romero hated.
Yeah, and I get why, but nowadays, fast zombies are terrifying.
Yeah, no, I mean,
I don't want to have to run from my fears. I would like to walk slowly away, please.
I mean, I don't know where that shift comes from, because, again, purists will argue that 28 Days Later isn't a zombie film, it's a virus, it's an infection movie. But at the core of it, it's a zombie film.
Yes.
It's a mindless creature, and we go back to the very origin of the word zombie. It is a mindless creature bent on doing the will of its master in the original zombie. The bacteria, host, whatever is causing them to be infected.
Yes.
That is now their new master. It is a biological master.
Yeah, and that has been fun, especially since the reasoning given in the original movie for them being slow is, I think, the sheriff on an interview with the news crew, which I think I found out was an actual news guy, who they were like, do you want to come? And didn't explain to him what time he needed to be there. So he was awake for a very long time that day. No, the helicopter was a local news channel, and they were saying, those shots of the people walking the fields, Romero had them walk
a field. That was good. Let's do it again.
Yes.
And they made him walk like 2 miles that day.
Everyone was such a good trooper for this movie.
Oh, yeah. And that's the thing, though, too, is like, this is because it was a community involvement. It's like Jaws.
Yes.
Where they bring the community in. It becomes this event. It becomes this point in history that people have a connection to, that they can be proud of, especially parts of those areas like Martha's Vineyard in Jaws. Like,
yes.
Originally they're like, okay, whatever. But now it's become such a big part of their lives. Like, oh yeah, that's my uncle over there. That's my stepsister or whatever.
Yes, definitely. And I think one of the things, though, that sets this one apart from Jaws is the town in Jaws originally kind of got fed up with all of the Jaws nonsense. Understandably, they were there for a lot longer than they said they were gonna.
Yes.
This one, I couldn't find a single person who openly was like, I didn't have a good time.
Yeah.
All of them, even though they were like, oh yeah, we walked 2 miles that day, or like the news guy who he did the early morning news, so he'd been up since I think like 3 or 4 the previous day. He even still was like, yeah, I've been up for a really long time, and yeah, it was a little annoying, but I had a great time.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole spirit that George Romero started and really cemented this indie developer,
yes,
or the DIY projects. And
I think that mindset is where a lot of people originally enjoyed and got their start in loving horror. A good example would be the little girl in the movie who turns into a zombie. There's a really fun interview with her where her parents were explaining to her that she was going to get to be in a horror movie, and she was like, I was already a horror junkie. Even though I was a little kid, I was having the time of my life stabbing a pillow with a trowel.
Jeez. I'm glad she turned out okay, though.
She seemed to have been having a great time, but I feel like that was a lot of us as kids, like, and even now, like, we, especially the older horror movies, were in it because the special effects were just a ham bone with some extra wax and chocolate sauce on it, or, oh, this thing over here is just some string holding everything up. Isn't that so cool? Look how awesome this turned out. Yeah, it's supposed to be a scary movie, but you don't watch it to be scared. You watch it to be part of the fun of making it.
Exactly. And that's one thing Romero talks about is these movies are different experiences on who you watch them with.
Definitely.
Whether you watch them alone, whether you watch them with a group, which, fortunately, this one we couldn't get time to watch as a group because...
So busy. Busy.
And I was out of town for almost a whole week, so... Yeah,
makes it a little bit difficult. But this one is definitely a good group movie, especially if you have non-horror people in your group.
Yeah.
Because I think the brief handful of gross, quote-unquote gross scenes could arguably be the flesh-eating scene.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go in knowing, oh, it's boiled ham with some wax and chocolate sauce on it, well, now it's not as gross.
Well,
now it's more of, wow, it turned out so good on film.
I mean, there's a couple parts I could see, like them chewing on the intestines because...
Yeah, that's kind of nasty.
Yeah.
Or like, if you're not I do not like foreign things in people's mouths. Do not open plastic with your teeth. That is disgusting. So the one scene where the one zombie picks a very clearly rubber bug off of a tree and puts it in her mouth, take it out. Do not eat that.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a movie that's worth a watch. Like, especially just as film history. I mean, this movie, it's so amazing to see that this small independent movie became part of the Library of Congress's archives.
Yes. And especially if you like things like the recent zombie movies like World War Z, like the Walking Dead series, like Resident Evil, this movie is really great to watch because, some of it isn't scary anymore. Some of the characters might be a little grating by today's standards, but you can clearly see where all of those things that you love, you can easily pinpoint where they are in this movie. And it's really fun to see that progression.
Yeah, and I'm really interested because a good chunk of my zombie movies are a few from the early are from the 70s.
I was gonna say, you moving down the timeline there.
Yes. Well, I mean, I do have a background in like the early 30s and stuff.
Sure. My favorite horror, especially monster movies, is the earlier works, just because there wasn't a whole lot to have before that. So a good example are like the first werewolf movies. I love them. They look awful.
Yes.
But this is where our ideas all came from. And it's really fun and easy to see where those come from this movie. Especially because, despite it being so low budget, despite it having kind of an odd timeline for filming, like none of this was filmed in sequence, things were filmed, and then 6 months later they decided they wanted to refilm it, it still works so beautifully, which a lot of older movies, especially the monster and horror genre, they can't make that claim.
No.
They're fun, they're kooky, but they're by no means a masterpiece of a film.
Yes, and that is one thing you could say about this movie, is it is a masterpiece.
Definitely.
In all honesty, I don't think there has been a zombie movie that I've enjoyed as much as this one in a long time. I mean, I'm really curious to see where the genre is going to go, because I read World War Z. I like the book a lot better than the movie, but I understand commercially why they took it and had one character going through all the events rather than kind of a memoir style, which could have been really cool, but it wouldn't get the same mainstream success, because World War Z is the top grossing zombie film. Yeah.
Well, and even, like, my favorite zombie film, hands down, if you exclude this movie, would easily be Zombieland. Mm-hmm. But you could very arguably say that Zombieland is just a very long-historied parody of this movie. All of the tropes are still there. A lot of the characteristics are there, just exaggerated and brought into more modern-day standards.
It kind of plays off of Scream.
Yeah.
Where he sets the rules. You don't do this in a horror film. You don't do this in a horror film. He's doing exactly that in the very beginning of Zombieland, and how he survived so long.
All of his rules. Yeah. And so, like, I'm excited to see, where Zombieland goes, because I do think that the writers for that franchise are clever enough to not let it slide into the just redundancy that Scream managed to hit after, I think, the third one.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they've got a lot to play with, because while the first one definitely played off of the original zombie concept in a more Midwestern stereotypical setting, that was only the beginning of the franchise. Since then, we've only gotten more variations for them to play with.
And even with internationally, I'm very curious to see where this is going to go, because one of my favorite zombie films is a French film called The Horde.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, where that all takes place in an apartment complex.
And I think...
And it deals with police corruption, too, which is kind of an interesting
twist
viewpoint
on things, especially since this one made a huge effort to show as best they could the government helping actively. And even the police force, while they are in the wrong at the end of this movie, they are trying their best to help.
Well, I don't even consider them in the wrong at the end of the movie. They just see a lumbering figure in the window.
Yeah, and
they don't know any better.
And I do think this movie does something that the rest of the zombie franchise since then has done, but not quite to maybe this level. Every character made the wrong choice. It was just when they made that choice that caused the problem.
And even then, there wasn't a right choice to begin with.
There was no winning.
Yeah, it's like we're taught in architecture, the difficult problem where there is no right answer.
Yes. And I think that's part of the reason why this movie is the example for all others to follow, is because there isn't a true winner in our cast of characters. There's clearly going to be a winner for the people outside of this story, because the sheriff seems very confident in his ability to shoot all these zombies. Sweeping the countryside real well. But for our main cast, for the people that we were invested in, there was no correct answer for any of this, no matter which option they picked. And they explored individually all of the options that we were presented with.
Yes.
And I think because none of our heroes actually had a chance to succeed, and we had multiple options to succeed, I think that's why this movie is such the example it is. There isn't one character who manages to win or doesn't win. Nobody wins.
Yep. It's a lose-lose situation.
Except for that sheriff. He's having a good time.
Except he's probably dead by the next movie.
I haven't seen any of the sequels for this, so I do not know if they are continuations. I would kind of want to watch them, but I will say the gentleman who played the sheriff in the 40th anniversary documentary very much embodies that sheriff.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't think he was acting too hard.
Probably not. So, Chris, what would you actually... We've talked a lot about the movie. What would you give it as a rating?
This movie, hands down, for me, is a 10 out of 10, even if you're not in the horror genre for me.
Mm-hmm.
This movie is old enough and well put together enough that even if you're not in the horror genre, it's still worth a watch. It's still worth one get through, especially if you have a group of friends. And it's a 15 out of 10 for me if you have a group of friends who are all into horror, because this is a good laugh. It's a good giggle as a group because of the fun special effects, because of the low budget, because of some of the...
stupid decisions.
Mostly Barbara.
Yeah. Well, for me, regardless of your taste in film, this is definitely a movie that you should watch. It is such a turning point in not only zombie movies, but what horror movies and independent movies could be.
Definitely.
It's inspired countless generations, and we can still see George Romero's mark on that genre.
Agreed.
Anywho, this has been The Good, the Bad, and the Weird.
Thanks for listening.
Peace.